We're seeing the complete unraveling of 30 years of U.S. policy, because it really is 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union, when the United States declared itself champion of the world, the sole superpower, the indispensable nation. And we're seeing that unravel. It's unraveling, of course, in Ukraine, and the Ukraine war is about that very issue. It's unraveling in the Middle East because the United States cannot dictate terms. It's unraveling because the United States finds yet again that when you have client states, puppet states almost, or not quite puppet states, but client states like Ukraine and Israel, they also have their own ideas which are not exactly beneficial for the country backing them, the United States. So we have a profound mess. The core of this is the U.S. arrogance and presumptuousness that it runs the world. And one can see, for an arrogant country that had won the Cold War, with a lot of not very clever people running it in the early 1990s, how they might come to that. So they adopted the neocon idea that the U.S. runs the world. What that meant in on-the-ground terms in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union is that NATO would move in where the Soviet Union had moved out. And that is why we have a war in Ukraine, because that was not a very clever or sensible or credible idea. In the Middle East, the idea was the United States would set the terms. Israel, for a lot of reasons, historical, ideological, domestic politics, lobbying, has a huge role in U.S. politics. But the United States has felt, everything's fine. And we got the complete confirmation of that by the idiotic statement of Jake Sullivan 4 weeks ago that this is the quietest time I guess it was 6 weeks ago, the quietest time in the Middle East in 2 decades, showing how completely surrealistic things have become. When it comes to China, the idea was that China would fall into a U.S.-run system, when China said, actually, we'd like a UN-run system. The United States said, what the hell are you talking about? We will contain you. And that started about 10 years ago. You don't contain such a successful, dynamic country, civilization, one could say. And this is also unraveling. So what we're seeing simultaneously around the world is that the presumptuousness of American unipolarity, of course, is a complete anachronism. It never was right, but it is an utter anachronism now. What is amazing is our octogenarian president, in that miserable speech that he gave a couple of weeks ago, repeated every one of these tropes about the indispensable country, the world yearning for U.S. leadership, which shows that he's, of course, not surprisingly for an octogenarian, living 30 years out of date. So what a mess we have, basically. All of this has come against reality. The reality is Russia was not going to accept NATO enlargement to Ukraine. They made that very clear. President Putin made that very clear in 2007. And we're just living that now. China made clear it's not accepting a U.S. rules-based order, that horrible expression of the United States, which means the opposite of a rules-based order, actually. And so this is also unraveling. And what's happening in Israel is Israel wants peace only on extremist terms. This is the basic point. Israel is ruled by a right-wing group that believes that Israel should dominate not only Israel, but also Palestine. And that has been the policy in Israel essentially for decades, but it has been the policy of Netanyahu during his whole premiership. And it's a completely untenable policy because it means no peace. And the United States has backed this for our weird domestic political reasons, even though it guarantees no peace. But the reason it fits into this broader narrative of the U.S. Arrogant unipolarity is the United States thought it could do this, exactly as Jake Sullivan said, that it can impose its own reality, but it can't. So that's the situation. I don't think Biden is clever enough to find a way out. A presidential election year is always fraught with surprise and stupidity. Biden's foreign policy team is the weakest that one can imagine. So, you know, none of it is very promising. At the other side, you keep mentioning it, Alexander, in your broadcasts, completely right. The world, broadly speaking, is aligned on a pretty sensible path. If you take the U.S. out of the picture, almost all of the world says, come on, two-state solution, for example. Then we could actually have peace and security for Israel and peace and security for the Palestinians. So if there is a glimmer of hope in all of this, it is that the world is not fundamentally divided. Actually, the world is rather united. On Ukraine, they want NATO to stop enlarging and they want peace. On U.S.-China, they want calm down. We don't want to choose sides. And on the Middle East, they overwhelmingly want a two-state solution. So the question is, as the U.S. unipolarity unravels, as it's exposed for the absurdity that many of us have been saying for 30 years it is, can the world community, which actually does exist, I see it every day in my work at the UN, can it somehow push through some sense, even with the weakness of the U.S. Politics and the U.S. leadership? That's a big question. Things could get out of hand a lot faster than we know. It takes, one bad day of shelling in Lebanon or in Syria or in Iraq to blow the whole thing sky high, given our crazy politics. We have nuts like Senator Lindsey Graham who want to go to war anywhere, anytime, any moment. And if a bad shell hits a U.S. base and a lot of soldiers die, God knows where we're going to be. But at the same time, the world overwhelmingly wants peace. So that's the real situation. We have a collapse of U.S. foreign policy. It is an unraveling after 30 years. It's showing up in multiple places right now. It's not well understood in the United States leadership at all. But it is pretty well understood worldwide.
I have to say, I was very interested to see that when these Muslim countries came together in Riyadh, the centrality of the United Nations in what they were saying. I think people have grasped this because we don't actually talk very much about the United Nations in our media anymore, but they clearly see the route forward to trying to find some way to resolve this crisis. And it's important to say that the Saudis were there, the Iranians were there, the Egyptians were there, the Jordanians were there, everybody was there, the Syrians were there, they were all there, the Yemenis, everybody was there. They all say the United Nations is the key. They talked about legitimate resolutions, which means resolutions passed by the UN Security Council. They talk about international law, no mention of rules-based orders. They talk about implementing previous decisions of the United Nations. And they spoke again about respecting those decisions and about the Security Council itself taking action. So when you mention the global community, and the United Nations, it seems to me that we've got to a situation where the United Nations potentially is becoming meaningful as never before.
Yeah,
during the Cold War, it was divided between the power blocks. After the 1990s, the United States basically didn't bother with it because it thought it was all powerful. Now, the global community says this is the instrument we're going to start using.
It is a paradox, actually. You know, I have worked $1 a year for the UN for 23 years. They still owe me $23 because I've never seen it. But in any event, I have spent most of my time actually working for the UN and most of my time hearing, the UN's irrelevant. But the interesting thing is we absolutely need a place of international law. We absolutely need a place where the nations meet. Of course, it should be far more consequential. But when the chips are down, it is the place. It's the only place that has the hope of legitimacy. So I had the same feeling. You know, I've been quite unhappy that the UN hasn't played a larger role in the Ukraine war. Of course, it's stymied, and yet it could play a larger role, even with the divisions in the Security Council because of US-Russia. But it could play a larger role. But here, it is playing a very direct role, partly because there have been over 50 years of UN resolutions essentially calling for Israel to return the conquered territories from 1967 and to have a two-state solution. And with this conflict right now, that immediately came to the headlines again. And it also reminds us, by the way, just to digress for one moment, Israel could have had peace all along. The idea that it has no one to talk to, who could it negotiate with, how could we negotiate with Hamas is a bunch of nonsense. Because what's happened all this time is that all the world community has said, we'll give you security, but you have to accept a Palestinian state. And Israel has done everything possible to avoid that reality because of a mix of weirdness, some religious zealotry who believe we don't have to compromise, some cynics who believe because of power they don't have to compromise. But the point is that a solution has been there all along. The UN has been quite good on this, not in enforcing anything, but in declaring what the real answer is. And so when the Arab Islamic leaders met in Riyadh a couple of days ago, yes, they turned to international law because it has served them, at least in principle, not in actual outcome. It led me also to go back to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which is very interesting because that was a Saudi peace initiative in 2002, which said, make a two-state solution and the Arab countries will recognize Israel, have normal relations, end the state of conflict, and assure the security of the two countries. The answer's there right in front of us. The idea that there's intransigence, that it's impossible, is ridiculous. It's phony. It's an Israeli excuse. And the United States has stood behind Israel. But now that excuse means war crimes every day. And that makes that excuse untenable. So maybe we're moving towards something really, towards a solution.
I agree with that, by the way. I think that we're actually at a crossroads on this crisis. I think that events from this moment on are going to start moving faster than we've seen in the past. And maybe that be the one good thing. One hopes so, at least, that might come out of it if we can get through the stresses of the next few months. I just wanted to now turn to Ukraine, because, of course, you know, by the way, Ukraine is involved in the crisis. The United Nations is involved in the crisis in Ukraine. Very few people remember that the Minsk Agreement of 2015 was confirmed by a UN Security
15 to
Council
nothing.
resolution backed by Britain, France, and the United States, which has never been implemented. And again, had that agreement been implemented, there would not be a war in Ukraine now. Now, there's been a very interesting report that's just come out in Germany, and one of the co-authors was a man called Michael Schulenberg. I don't know whether you know him.
I know him very well. Yeah.
And also a German general, Harald Kujat. And they described very, blow-by-blow account of the negotiations that took place in March last year, which brought us to the very edge of an agreement. And it's clear that both sides were actually keen at that time to find an agreement. The Ukrainians, the Russians, there was surprise, it turns out, by how easily and quickly they negotiated with each other, how very quickly they found that they had common points of agreement with each other. And the intermediaries, of whom there were many, by the way, were surprised about this. And one thing, again, becomes clear from reading this is that when the United States and Britain began, and by the way, the NATO Secretariat, or so it seems to me, began to realize that these negotiations might succeed, even earlier than many of us expected, they were already making it clear to the Ukrainians that they did not want those negotiations to succeed. And we now have a detailed account, much more detailed than we've ever seen before, of what happened when Boris Johnson went to Kiev, and also of President Biden's own personal role, speaking to Western leaders, convening NATO summits, basically in order to stop a peace agreement being negotiated at that time. And I have to say, I was deeply shaken reading all of this. Even though one sensed it already, I was appalled. And now we have a war, and they expected that they would win that war. But now, of course, they're losing it.
Yeah, I'd been briefed about all of this in great detail during the past year. I flew to Ankara at one point to talk with the Turkish mediators to understand what happened. I've spoken with senior Russian officials who corroborated step by step exactly what I had heard from the Turkish mediators. I got an extremely accurate account from a very senior Russian official about all of this. So I wasn't surprised by this report, obviously, but I think that it is very well done. And it also helps to understand exactly the whole special military operation and what really was going on. Because what was going on from the beginning was the Russian government believing that Ukraine would quickly wise up and stop the NATO enlargement. And we know that Zelensky, within 3 days of February 24th, 2022, that is of the start of the special military operation, said, okay, NATO, we could be neutrals. It took 3 days. So this wasn't an attempt to invade the country and conquer Kiev and all the ridiculous things that were said. It was an attempt to get a negotiated outcome. And it could have come within a couple of weeks. And it was on the verge of coming within a couple of weeks. But the United States, really, the whole point was NATO enlargement. And this has become absolutely painfully clear. And all of the silly people who tried to deny this, the facts just spill out everywhere now. And now we're hearing this admission that the U.S. blocked the settlement, even in, I'd say, nearly the mainstream U.S. media, not the core of the core mainstream, but in a lot of places in the U.S. that, yes, the U.S. told them to fight on. And the Washington Post today, that miserable rag of a mouthpiece of the CIA, I'm afraid, tells them, fight on till today. Even today, they're running an editorial. You don't have to give up. You can fight on. You can fight on. It's unbelievable. It's pathetic the U.S. capacity to do damage right now, rather than to try to find solutions.
What about the prospects of a dialogue between the United States and Russia? Well, there is already a dialogue between the United States and China. It doesn't seem to be going particularly well, but some kind of a dialogue between the great powers, one would have thought was necessary, essential. I mean, as I said, the Russians seem open to it. The Americans?
Every day I tell the White House publicly, you can use my Zoom account if you want, call them up. There's absolutely no reason why Biden today could not get on the line with President Putin and say, you know, this whole NATO thing, let's work it out. And by the way, we got a lot of other things to talk about that are really serious, especially on the strategic arms side, because we've had just a complete collapse now of all of the nuclear arms agreements, one after another. This started again with the United States arrogance and audacity, unilaterally walking away from the ABM treaty in 2002. And that has to date, by the way, as a key moment for the Ukraine war as well. Because while the Ukraine war has many specific proximate causes, the overthrow of Yanukovych, the Minsk II, the NATO enlargement, the backdrop of it is Russia's absolute unhappiness with the unilateral placement of missiles in Eastern Europe and Russia's inability to engage the U.S. in any kind of negotiations. So this is to say that there's a lot to talk about on the two sides that is even beyond Ukraine, really goes back to ABM, to the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, which fell apart, to New START, which has now fallen apart, to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban, which is falling apart, everything. This is all, again, U.S. arrogance, because you can watch the unraveling of this. The sole superpower doesn't have to talk to anybody. So they believed. And now all of it is falling to pieces with an octogenarian president who can't find his way off stage and an incompetent team. And this is why the world is so dangerous right now. But yes, he should call today and say, let's wind this thing down. I admit, I've been pushing this for a long time, even though, by the way, you can find, of course, famously Biden talking in 1997 that NATO enlargement's okay, but if you go as far as the Baltics, oh, that's going to trigger a reaction from Russia. So once upon a time, Biden knew the truth or was willing to say it. But today, if Biden calls and says, let's start again, NATO's not going to enlarge, I'm going to make this perfectly clear, we got to get a settlement, we would move very quickly to some kind of resolution of this.
I'm glad you brought out arms control, because arms control is critically important in itself. I mean, this was universally understood when all of those arms control treaties were being painstakingly negotiated from the mid-1960s onwards. A ball set in train, I understand, by President Kennedy, by the way. I mean, the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty.
It was 60 years ago this year that the partial nuclear test ban treaty was negotiated. And that set the, by Kennedy's design, by the way, it was very explicit, not even implicit. It was very explicit that the next step would be a non-proliferation treaty. So Kennedy got this started in 1963. Then came the non-proliferation treaty. Then came détente and the beginning of arms control agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union. And a lot of progress was actually made. And the stupidest thing in the world is the United States unilaterally started to dismantle that. The first step was abandoning the ABM treaty in 2002, which was a horrendously dumb thing to do at a time of horrendously dumb U.S. leadership. But now I'm being redundant because it's been that way for 30 years, actually.
Yeah. But the other thing about arms control is that it provided the leaders of the superpowers of that era something to talk about. And of course, they had all those summit meetings: Brezhnev, Nixon, Carter, Brezhnev, Ford, Brezhnev, and then of course Gorbachev. And they got to know each other that way, and they got to understand each other. And we began to move forward on so many different fronts. And we had the Helsinki Final Act was all negotiated within the framework of the bigger arms control treaties. And there doesn't seem to be any understanding or movement of this nature at the moment.
It's exactly right. You'd think in the age of Zoom, it wouldn't be a big idea for the leaders to talk to each other pretty routinely. But we're still in this bizarre world where, okay, Biden and Xi are going to meet this week at the APEC summit. And it's been months or years. Can this meeting take place? This is a dangerous kind of thing when you have these real superpowers not talking at the top level. And as far as we know, Biden and Putin have not spoken one time since February 24th, 2022. Come on. The world's actually at stake. At least have a phone call, at least discuss the issues. But it's so studied that we don't talk to the other side. That's part of the whole mechanism of trying to keep this illusion of superpower hegemony alive. But it obviously doesn't work.
Absolutely. And just to proceed also, we don't have discussions with the Russians. We don't talk much to the various sides in the Middle East. I've been trying to work out the kind of diplomatic contacts which the United States is having with the big Middle East countries. And I have to say, it's not a happy picture. If you look at the State Department website and you look at the White House website, when they do have meetings or discussions with Arab and other Muslim leaders, one doesn't get the sense that very much discussion is taking place at all, actually. There doesn't seem to be much listening, and there doesn't seem to be much understanding of the other side's positions. And so far, no real meetings, as far as I can see.
I think that that's basically right. U.S. diplomacy has collapsed. Diplomacy actually means talking to the other side, listening to the perspectives, trying to find a way to common ground. It would not be hard, just as I said, on the Ukraine war. That war could have been ended any day from February 24th onward, and it could have been prevented any day before that. This is absolutely obvious. And this war in Gaza right now, which could become any moment a regional war, can also be ended because there's an open door to ending it. The open door to ending it is exactly what the Arab Islamic leaders said 2 days ago. It's exactly what the Arab peace process said. It's exactly what a raft of UN Security Council resolutions have said, and that is to recognize a state of Palestine, with the control over Palestinian territories in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, the control over the Islamic holy sites, and then within that agreement to disarm these militias and demobilize these militias. All of this is completely feasible. The sticking point is the United States has backed an absolutely extremist Israeli government, which would rather commit war crimes than to have a peace settlement. And the United States doesn't even understand the most basic issues of diplomacy. You don't even have to fly to the Middle East. All the ambassadors here, I sit down with them all the time. It would take about an hour to have a very interesting discussion around the table. I do it a lot. And you find out that there is a big meeting of the minds. The United States should learn again how to talk to others.
All right, from Sleepy Crane, for Jeffrey, was there a possibility for Crimea to remain independent like the Donbass was? It seems it joining Russia was the main rally point of public support for the escalation, as it was portrayed as illegal annexation?
Well, I think the key point is to understand that the annexation of Crimea followed the U.S. Overthrow of Yanukovych. And so the U.S. Conspired to overthrow a government in Kiev, and immediately the Russian leadership said, actually, we don't want Crimea falling into NATO hands. And one should understand that there was a perfectly sensible approach for Crimea. Russia was not demanding the return to Crimea before Yanukovych's overthrow. Russia and Ukraine had negotiated a long-term lease for the Sevastopol naval base. That's all. The lease went through 2042, and there was no demand for Crimea to become part of Russia. The U.S. provoked this. This U.S. addiction to regime change, which is another part of this, this is the weakest part of, I mean, it's not weakest, that's the wrong term. It's the most disastrous part of U.S. foreign policy going back to 1947. The U.S. political system got wrecked in 1947 by the National Security Act, which established a secret army known as the CIA. It established the CIA as an intelligence agency. Fine, that's countries need that. But as a secret army, as the separate side, even Truman knew when he was signing this, something's very dangerous about this. And he later bemoaned the fact that he had created this unaccountable secret army. I mention this because that secret army has played a role in destabilizing the world so incompetently, by the way, for decades. It's almost never reviewed. It was reviewed once by the Church Committee in the 1970s. But those of us who know events know how incredibly devastating CIA interventions have been all over the world and setting off civil wars repeatedly and so on. Okay, my point is that in February 2014, the United States, we know Victoria Nuland, I know many others, by the way, were directly involved in the overthrow of a Ukraine president that had negotiated a long-term lease of Sevastopol's naval base with Russia, fine, and who was in favor of neutrality. That was his great sin, that he didn't want to join NATO. So that was his great sin. The neocons had to get rid of him. The U.S. Deep state had to get rid of him. It was at that time that Russia said, sorry, Crimea's coming back to us. That has been fundamental for our security. And it has been our naval base since 1783. Thank you very much, but it's not going to fall into NATO hands. So that's the real background of that. And this is a basic point. Going back to 2013, Ukraine had its territorial integrity. There were no territorial demands on Ukraine. Ukraine was neutral and it was at peace. The United States could not accept the neutrality. So they did a regime change operation. That started this complete mess. Russia took Crimea. The Ukrainian rightist government started to attack the ethnic Russian Donbas region. That led to Minsk I and then Minsk II, backed by the UN Security Council. And the United States told the Ukrainians, forget it. You don't have to do that. We want a unitary state, not a federal state, as Minsk II was calling for. So the U.S. lost again. Even then, Russia was not calling for territory. It was only calling for autonomy. And the U.S. could not take yes for an answer. December 17, 2021, President Putin puts on the table a draft security arrangement with the U.S. based on no NATO enlargement. The United States formally says, we don't have to talk to you about that at all. That's not your business, as if NATO enlargement is not Russia's business. And then starts coming the independence of Donbass, then the annexation of Donbass by the Duma and incorporation into Russia. In other words, if you play a lousy poker hand and you keep escalating, you keep raising the stakes on a losing hand, you end up destroying yourself. Well, the U.S. is destroying Ukraine step by step because Russia wasn't demanding Ukrainian territory, not Crimea, not the Donbass, until the U.S. kept pushing, because it could not make a compromise. Not even a compromise. It couldn't make the sensible step of saying, NATO to Ukraine, that's a step too far. And again, I want to emphasize that the backdrop to that, Russia had many reasons for opposing NATO enlargement, but one of them was that the U.S. had unilaterally walked away from the nuclear arms agreements and was placing Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And so Russia was saying, from a pure, direct, minutes to Moscow security consideration, we don't want you here. It makes perfect sense, and the United States should have listened. Well, it's a disaster, of course. What Israel is doing is a danger to Israel. It is absolutely one war crime after another in Gaza. It is not going to lead to any kind of safety for Israel. So we have yet another absolute disaster on our hands, which is worsening American security, world security, pushing the chances of more global war. So I can't say I'm, well, no one can be happy about this. The Hamas attack was horrific. The response has been absolutely mind-boggling in its inappropriateness and the damage that it's creating. Today, as I'm sure you know, a lawsuit was filed in the federal court of District Court for Northern District of California by what is the name of the group? The Center for Constitutional Rights, saying that America is complicit in genocide. So with a brief that is horrifying, actually, because it's dozens of pages of all of the horrific things that are being committed by Israel right now. So this has to stop. This is extraordinarily destructive and dangerous.
Yeah, there's no question this has become an American war, as almost every Israeli war has, and the Biden administration made clear we're going to give Israel everything it needs. Everybody knows in that region and around the world that when they see a bomb dropping on a hospital or an ambulance or a church or a school or a mosque, even with the Israeli claim that Hamas is there, everybody knows those are actually American bombs. America feeds Israel the bombs and pays for the bombs, and any reverberations on Israel always spill over to the United States as well. We have a sizable part of our audience, not a majority, I don't think, but certainly a non-trivial portion of our audience that definitely supports Israel. Maybe not everything they're doing, but certainly their response. And their argument is the following, and I want to get your response to it. Look, Israel was attacked in this, as you said, horrific way. We don't know exactly how many civilians died. Israel readjusted the number from 1,400 to 1,200 without a lot of explanation. Many hundreds of those people were on military bases, were soldiers. Other civilians were killed from the Israeli response, but obviously Hamas deliberately killed a lot of civilians. And their argument is no country could tolerate security breaches of that kind. You keep criticizing what Israel is doing, but what should Israel do in order to prevent an attack like this from happening again?
Well, the first thing is Israel let its guard down, which it should not have done. This was a major security and intelligence failure. Israel had been warned in the days leading up to October 7 that the Hamas militants were going to undertake some kind of operation. The Egyptian government gave the warnings, but Israel has the worst government in its history. The government failed completely. In fact, it is reported widely that soldiers that were guarding the border of Gaza and Israel were on holiday or had been shifted to the West Bank. Therefore, Israel let its guard down, and the first thing it should do is keep its guard up. So this is very basic. Second thing that should have happened is that Netanyahu should have stepped down and taken responsibility for this massive failure. The third is to think, what is going to deliver Israeli security? Now, launching a massive war in Gaza, leveling a large part of northern Gaza, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, killing more than 11,000 people and more than 4,500 children. And those are just the identified deaths, because it is widely presumed that there are thousands of children and others under the rubble still whose deaths have not been accounted. The idea that this is going to lead to security is mind-boggling. What it has done is to isolate Israel almost entirely in the world. Israel has one backer left. That's the United States. I would say within the United Nations, of the 193 countries, you can't count. Certainly, you don't need two hands to count the number of countries that support what Israel's doing. Probably it's on one hand maximum. Israel has isolated itself. It's committing war crimes. Today, it was said that more than 100 UN workers have been killed in this attack. The brazenness of it is also matched by the rhetoric, the intentionality of this extreme right-wing cabinet to level Gaza, to treat the residents of Gaza as animals. That's their line. To say that Gaza will never recover from this. In other words, this brief that was filed about genocide documents the shocking statements, because one of the conditions for a claim of genocide under the Genocide Treaty is intent. And there is such vulgarity in the language of this extremist right-wing government that it's there for all to see the ugliness of it. Now, Israel needs security, but it is never going to achieve security unless there is a political settlement of a conflict that has been going on at least, one could say, for 57 years, since 56 years since the Six-Day War in 1967. And that political settlement requires the political rights of the Palestinian people. And this government not only has launched a war that it cannot win, that could spread to regional war, but it absolutely opposes vehemently, vulgarly, any kind of two-state solution, which almost all the, in fact, I would say the rest of the world, because even on that score, the United States has reiterated almost every day in recent days that that's the only way forward. But this is a government which utterly rejects this. So they're launching a war that they cannot win, that will kill tens of thousands of innocents, and without any political vision at all other than continued domination by Israel of the Palestinian people, which means no peace at all. So nobody, no friend of Israel should be satisfied for one moment that what's happening is in Israel's interest. There isn't anything that's happening that isn't self-destructive of Israel, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, that Netanyahu is creating destruction of Israel. He's the worst prime minister Israel has ever had. This cabinet is the most extremist that Israel has ever had. And this cabinet is doing grave damage to Israel, starting with letting Israel's basic guard down and then responding in a way which is absolutely destructive of Israel's security and its interests.
I think the event that comes to mind almost immediately, and this is something we've been emphasizing since the very first days after the October 7th attack, when I think the space to kind of criticize Israel was very limited. People were very traumatized by watching those images coming out of Israel. No one wanted to hear any criticism of Israel. So the thing we tried to say early on was, look, we have a historical lesson, a recent historical lesson that's highly comparable, which is we also suffered a terrible terrorist attack on 9/11 22 years ago, and 3,000 civilians were killed on that day. Two gigantic skyscrapers in New York City came crashing down on top of our fellow citizens. A plane was flown into the Pentagon. It was very traumatic. It was very outrageous. And a lot of people have spent the last 20 years talking about the lessons of 9/11, the idea that we overreacted, we fell into bin Laden's hands by doing exactly what he hoped we would do, which was turn the world against us by going around the world madly bombing in a quest for vengeance, but no real geostrategic plan. We said we were going to go to Afghanistan to destroy the Taliban, and 20 years later, we left Afghanistan. The Taliban waltzed right back into power as though nothing had happened, because 20 years of occupation and war radicalized the population even further against the West and in favor of the Taliban. But one of the things that has happened, and what happened back then after 9/11, was anybody who stood up and questioned these wars and what Bush and Cheney were doing with torture and Guantanamo and rendition and that whole panoply of things they wanted to do, everybody got accused who objected of being pro-terrorist or unpatriotic or on the side of al-Qaeda, and it was very effective. It really repressed dissent for a long time in the United States. The tactic that's being used now, not just in Israel but also in the United States, is to say that anyone who isn't fully supportive of the Israeli war is obviously guilty of anti-Semitism, must hate Jews. As a Jew myself, I've heard that, I don't know how many times every day for the last 5 weeks as I've expressed these criticisms of the Israeli response. I'm wondering what you make of that as a tactic, and how do you react to that when you hear that?
Well, let me say the analogy with 9/11 is even more direct. It's said that the United States acted with rage and therefore made a lot of grave errors. But I think it's actually deeper than that. The United States government at the time, I would not say the nation, but I would say the government under George W. Bush Jr. and Cheney didn't react with rage so much as react with a planned neocon agenda, which was actually already in place in the late 1990s, the Project for a New American Century. And the idea of the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, was in a unipolar world, so they thought in their delusions, that the U.S. stands alone in its power and can do whatever it wants and define reality the way that it wants, was literally described by one of the neocon protagonists, was that 9/11 would be used to take out every American foe. And so we know that the first reaction to 9/11 wasn't even al-Qaeda or Afghanistan. The first reaction was Iraq. Now we can go after Iraq. Now we can go after Saddam Hussein. And it was questioned, what do you mean Iraq? Don't you mean Afghanistan? No, 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 we mean Iraq. Now we can do what we have wanted to do. And so this was an agenda of the United States. It was absolutely mind-boggling in its craziness, in its ineptitude, in the trillions of dollars that it cost, in the destruction of America's reputation around the world, in the free fall of American prestige, which, believe me, happened and continues to happen and has changed the world and diminished America's safety from not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but the not so covert operations to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, the mobilization of NATO to overthrow Gaddafi. This was all a sequence of operations that was anticipated already in the late 1990s. Now, the reason I make all of this analogy is this government of Netanyahu is not just acting with rage, it's acting with an agenda. And you look across the cabinet and listen to the words of Smotrich, the finance minister, of course, to Netanyahu himself, who's just the most awful prime minister in Israel's history, to the interior minister, to across the board. They have an agenda. The agenda has been what is called the Greater Israel, or Greater Land of Israel, which is that Israel really should control in any way not only Israel, but the Palestinian territories, Gaza and the West Bank. And for some, it goes even beyond that, because they look to the book of Joshua in the Bible and say, oh, the promised land is even beyond that. What they're doing is
includes like Jordan and multiple Middle Eastern countries, all part of Greater Israel.
It actually goes to Mesopotamia, it goes to the Euphrates,
right.
no less. So it's a kind of mind-boggling book, by the way, to read, because it's a book of serial genocides, as a matter of fact. But the point is that this cabinet wants to clear out Gaza. That was the first impulse. Actually, the United States was almost pulled along. They tried to talk El-Sisi in Egypt into this. He said, no way I'm going to be a party to the next Nakba, the next disaster of the Palestinian people by opening Rafah, the border with Gaza and Egypt, to take in hundreds of thousands of Gazans fleeing after Israel told them, you must flee for your life, giving them a few hours to flee for their life. So this is an agenda. And in that sense, the analogy to 9/11 is even more precise. It's not just blind rage. It's a political agenda. And we should understand, I think it's the smartest words about war that have been uttered since Sun Tzu, since the strategy of war in ancient China, by von Clausewitz, the war theorist in Germany in the period just after the Napoleonic Wars. And in von Clausewitz's famous book on war, he says very famously that war is the continuation of politics with other means. And so when you see conflict, think politics. Don't just think rage or attack and counterattack, but what's the underlying politics? In Ukraine, the underlying politics is NATO enlargement. This is a war over NATO enlargement, which I think was a reckless thing for the United States to do, and it put Ukraine into the battleground of a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, which is destroying Ukraine. Now, what is the politics here? The politics here is that the people of Palestine do not have political rights. They live in a condition dominated by Israel, effectively, as countless organizations have rightly pointed out, an apartheid system imposed by Israel. And the whole world, including the United States, has said this has to be remedied by a Palestinian state. And even President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken have repeated this several times. in the last days. But this is precisely what Netanyahu and his government oppose. So this is not a war to end the Hamas threat in order to move to a state of Palestine. Completely the opposite. This is a war being waged by Israel ostensibly to crush Hamas, but to dominate.
One of the main disagreements between the U.S. and the Netanyahu administration right now is the reoccupation of Gaza. It seems that the Netanyahu administration is willing to keep control of this part, but the U.S. foreign policy is not in agreement with this decision. How do you see this issue?
This is a very fundamental issue because it goes to a deeper question, which is what is the political resolution of all of this? It needs to be a Palestinian state, but that's exactly what the Netanyahu government opposes. So this is why we're in this crisis to begin with, that there has not been a Palestinian state established despite more than 50 years of talking about it. And Netanyahu, who has been prime minister over most of the last 15 years in Israel, actively opposes a Palestinian state, actively opposes any limits on Israeli settlers in occupied Palestinian land, actively opposes Palestinian rights in East Jerusalem. So there's no political solution. We have, therefore, seething unrest, the terrorist attack by Hamas on October 7, now a brutal war filled with war crimes committed by Israel, but no political outcome because Netanyahu and his right-wing government don't want to acknowledge Palestinian political rights. And this is the crux of the matter. The United States is mumbling the right things, but typically in U.S. politics, the U.S. will back Israel because our politicians are trained to believe that if they show any real resistance to Israeli politics, they'll get punished domestically by Jewish voters or by Christian Zionists, and there are a lot of those. So this is the issue. There's a clear path to peace, in my view, which is a Palestinian state. Netanyahu opposes that. The U.S. is torn because it wants to support Israel, and yet at the same time, Israel's position is untenable. And that's what this argument is about.
It seems that the U.S. official policy in Israel is this two-state solution, as Antony Blinken said in his last meeting with Mahmoud Abbas. How is that possible? Because we have the West Bank and we have the Gaza Strip. How we can connect these two parts? There are many things in these discussions to be considered. Some people are suggesting one-state solution, something like Belgium, what we're seeing in Belgium. On the other part, you mentioned two-state solution, like in Cyprus, North Cyprus and South Cyprus. We have the presence of UN at the middle.
Of course, over decades, it's become harder to solve because Israel, quite cynically and knowingly, launched a settler campaign in the occupied territories beginning in the early 1970s. This wasn't spontaneous. This was part of Israel's security moves under something at the time called the Alon Plan. And the idea was to make settlements in strategic areas in the West Bank. And they've done that. And there are now hundreds of thousands, by one count, more than 400,000 settlers in Palestine, in the West Bank, and another 200,000 plus in East Jerusalem. So this makes things difficult. The taste for a one-state solution is essentially zero. I think it, in theory, could have a lot of merit, but it has no support in either side of this crisis. So I think combining that with the fact that there are 50 plus years of UN resolutions on the two-state solution, we should focus on implementing what has been promised and committed for decades but never achieved. And I believe it's time for the Security Council to meet tomorrow and vote a Palestinian state and membership in the United Nations, and to tell Israel that's the reality. It's not about your negotiations with the Palestinian Authority or anything else. This is a new world of a Palestinian state, and they're a UN member state, and you have to clear from occupied lands. Now, clearing, I think personally, it would be fine for settlers to remain in their villages in Palestine. Those are details, in my view, significant ones. But the most important thing is to declare a Palestinian state and to disarm the militias as part of an overall peace settlement that establishes Palestinian political rights.
In Palestine, we have two authorities. We have the Gaza Strip, we have the West Bank. Is there any connection between them? Do they have any relations? How does it work?
Well, basically, neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority are really viable representatives of Palestine. Hamas has committed terrorist atrocities and ruled itself out from that. The Palestinian Authority is basically manipulated by the United States and Israel because its funding is controlled essentially from the United States and Israel. So I think the fact is it's hard to have a responsible authority without a state. It's time to have a state first. Construct a process to build a national government that would cover both Gaza and the West Bank. I think there needs to be also a physical connection between the two so that there's travel between the two areas. So there needs to be a transport corridor and other basic features of sovereignty that make this a viable state. But I think we just need to pick up the pace because you had the Oslo peace process, 10 years didn't lead anywhere. There are too many on both sides, but many in Israel that just don't want an outcome of two states, and they're able to block it nonstop. The rest of the world wants a two-state solution because, frankly, our global peace depends on it. This is awful to have these wars break out every few years. And so it's time really for the Security Council unanimously and the General Assembly, maybe by a vote of 192-1, if that's what it takes, with Israel being the only one not on side, to establish the basic parameters of peace.
How do you see the Netanyahu administration? It seems to me that they don't have any long-term policy for that region. At the end of the day, they have to learn how to live, how to coexist with these Arab nations. To make,
of course, but they've never believed that, and they've thought that the U.S. has their back. But if you look at history, the U.S. has had the back of a lot of countries that it didn't actually protect in the end. So Israel should be smarter than that. And it's a big mistake of policy, but their politicians are not visionaries. They're very rarely statesmen. Netanyahu is fighting for his political life hour by hour right now, day by day. They have no long-term answer to these questions. They believe for the moment that U.S. support is safe, but even in the U.S., we see huge differences between young people and older people. Older people tend to be much more pro-Israel, younger people much more pro-Palestine. So the Israelis should understand this is absolutely an unsustainable course. Morally, politically, geopolitically, militarily, everything. They need to do something else.
right now we have some sort of agreement between Sunni and Shia all together against Israel. How the geopolitical of that region is changing, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a very important question because one of Israel's claims is we just have implacable foes and there's no one to talk to. And this is false. First, there absolutely were Palestinian counterparts to talk to. And the Israelis, in my view, never wanted to talk straightforwardly with them. They always wanted a deal, which was not really an adequate deal. Then came the question of the Arab states. And the Arab states were viewed by Israel as implacable enemies, but the Arab states said back in 2002, more than 20 years ago, look, make a two-state solution. We normalize relations with you. We work for the security of both Israel and a Palestinian state. The conflict is over. That was the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative. Did Israel grab at it? No, because there were forces in Israel that said, we don't want to compromise. We want the greater Israel, territorially. This is religious zealotry or cynicism or misguided ideas about security. It's actually a mix of all of those. But in any event, no, they did not rise to the occasion. Then their argument was, okay, maybe the Arabs, but Iran is an implacable foe. This also is not true. Actually, Iran has tried for a number of years to negotiate. The most important negotiation, of course, was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, negotiated between Iran and Europe and the United States over ending sanctions and Iran ending its nuclear program, bringing it under control. Signed, sealed, and then reneged on by the United States, which says, we're not going to do it. That's diplomacy. Then they say, oh, you can't negotiate with Iran. Well, Iran negotiated. Then it said, well, Iran is a renegade state, but Iran has just made peaceful relations and reconciliation with Saudi Arabia. That's a big deal because if the Saudis want peace, Iran is going to go along with this because Iran is becoming part of the neighborhood in an absolutely diplomatic way. Iran is joining the BRICS countries. So that means, is Iran going to say, we continue our war with Israel, even as Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt and Ethiopia, all the BRICS say, no, you don't? Are they really going to do that? No, they're not going to do that. So we have the makings of a diplomatic settlement. I think the big responsibility is for Netanyahu to step down today because he's a failure and did not protect Israel and is a very divisive figure and opposed a political settlement, and for an Israeli government to reach out to the Arab neighbors and say, okay, we want peace. We accept a two-state solution. We need the UN to take responsibility. We need peacekeepers. We need demobilization of Hamas and disarmament of the militias and many other things, but all of that's within reach. Of course, Netanyahu's not going to be the one to say it, but he shouldn't be prime minister.
You talk about Netanyahu. As long as I remember, he was in charge, he was in power in Israel. Is there any alternative for his administration in Israel?
I'm much older than you, so I easily remember many, many, many prime ministers other than Netanyahu. He's finished. It's time for him to go. There will be so many new politicians. Politicians come and go. There are not indispensable politicians. And what there is the structural realities. And Israel's structural reality is that it needs to accept the Palestinian state and it needs to make peace with its neighbors. And I'm sure that there are going to be politicians that will fill the bill because politics is like a job search. You put up a terms of reference, and you get 100 applicants, and you choose one of them. So the terms of reference are make peace, stop this bloody war, and we'll find a lot of applicants for that position.
Turkey has a very crucial, important role for Israel. How do you see their relations right now?
Of course, Israel and Turkey have had good relations, and Erdogan had good relations with Israel, but Erdogan is saying right now, you're committing war crimes. You need to stop this. And Turkey is making a referral to the International Criminal Court of the Israeli leaders because they're committing war crimes. So Erdogan is standing up for the Palestinian position. He's right to do so, in my view. He's not anti-Israel, but he is absolutely against this war, and he's calling it straight. Now, there was an important meeting in Riyadh a few days ago that is called the Arab Islamic Summit that was both Arab leaders, Saudis, Egyptians, Jordanians, Syria with Bashar al-Assad going, also Turkey, very important, also Iran. So this is very interesting. You know, the region is finding a new language of cooperation. It needs to. The climate crisis, the energy crisis, the economic crisis is all very severe. And the leaders of the OIC, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, are meeting together and cooperating together. And I'm excited by the fact that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iran, Ethiopia, but the four Muslim countries are all joining the BRICS. Good. This is a lot of regional cooperation that I think is quite important, and I think Erdogan plays a constructive role in that and aims to play a constructive role.
How much is the influence of the U.S. foreign policy on the Netanyahu administration, on Israel? How do you see this? Can they force them to do something? Can they pressure them to do something, in your opinion?
Yes, I would say the U.S. influence is decisive, because if the U.S. Does not have Israel's back militarily, Israel has to have a political approach. Israel needs artillery shells. It needs the backing of the U.S. fleet. It needs military support, financial support. If the United States says, no, you have to stop, believe me, Israel will stop. It won't take long. What is Israel going to do? It depends on the United States. But the idea has been all along that Israel has the upper hand because of U.S. domestic politics, but I think that this is changing.
Do you see any possibility of a larger war in that region? Because we remember we had in Syria, during Obama administration, we had some sort of false flag attacks, operations. And do you see anything like that to happen in that region?
I would say for two reasons, the answer is yes. One is that sparks are flying, missiles are flying. American soldiers are being attacked and wounded. Israel is bombing southern Lebanon. Hezbollah's firing missiles. There's every reason that this can spread. But I would say a second reason is, my guess is that Netanyahu would like it to spread. Because if it doesn't spread, the pressure is going to come on Israel to end what they're doing. And what Netanyahu wants to do, I think, is to ensnare the United States into direct fighting. That would be horrible. It would be devastating for Biden's politics. So I think the U.S. will stay away, except if one of these missiles kills a lot of U.S. soldiers, it becomes very hard in the U.S. also to resist retaliation and escalation. So we need to end this before something gets out of hand. Wars like this can really get out of hand fast.
Some politicians in the U.S., Lindsey Graham, is suggesting attacking Iran, bombing Iran. I talked with Colonel Larry Wilkerson. He said that it's impossible. We studied if we can win in a war with Iran, in a conventional war like Russia is doing in Ukraine. It's impossible to win this war without going nuclear. How do you see this issue? Is that a viable choice? Why they're suggesting that?
Well, I would say two things. One, I'm very interested to hear what Wilkerson says, because he knows more about this than I do. And second, I can tell you Lindsey Graham's an idiot. So I'm sorry to say it. You know, we have senators that are idiots, and Lindsey Graham is a fool. And he's been a fool all along, and he's very dangerous, and there isn't a war that he doesn't love. And he has pushed the Ukraine war to complete disaster for Ukraine. And now he wants war in the Middle East. He's a fool. That's it.
If this conflict goes to Hezbollah, then Syria, then Iran, it would bring in Russia and finally possibly China in this conflict.
Look, all wars can spread when sparks are flying, or bullets are flying, or missiles are flying. You can always detonate the next weapons depot deliberately or inadvertently. You can always trigger another escalation. I don't think you can look at this and consider these people geniuses that are involved in this. They operate by limited information, gut, their domestic politics, their moods. And so this is very, very dangerous. Never let wars go on that can be stopped by negotiation, because things can get out of hand. You know, it was a few bullets that started World War I. And we should not underestimate the risks of this. Same with Ukraine, even till today. These wars need to stop. They need to stop through negotiation now. And it has been U.S. mistakes of not understanding negotiation. In Ukraine, the U.S. has rejected all negotiations up until now. In the Middle East, I think they sense they need to do something different, because the whole world is aligned against this war, other than Israel. And so I think the U.S. leadership is feeling the tensions much more than in Ukraine. And that's why we're hearing even semi-reasonable things coming from the White House. They're not acting on them yet because, again, politicians in the U.S. are afraid to stand up to Israel, typically because of their perceived risk of political backlash at home. But they're going to learn standing with Israel in an intolerable war that has no political solution offered by the Israelis doesn't work for U.S. security. It's just way too dangerous. So I think events are going to move forward, but they could get out of hand before they reach a settlement. So I'm urging a settlement as absolutely as fast as possible.
Well, let me say, first of all, just as a point of policy, if the United States government said we need a two-state solution and we need it now, it needs to be the object of whatever actions are taken, first of all, the United States would find itself in partnership with all of the rest of the world, with the single exception, I would say, single exception of the Netanyahu government. And the Netanyahu government does not speak for the interests of the Israeli people, nor, I think, for the Israeli people at all right now. But the point is, if the United States followed through on the logic of what Biden and Blinken have said in recent days, they would find that the United States is part of a complete global consensus. That global consensus would effectively be exercised very directly and institutionally in the UN Security Council, where there would be immediately a unanimous vote for a ceasefire based on moving to a two-state solution. And just so every listener understands correctly my own thought about this, that move to a two-state solution would include intrinsically the demilitarization, disarming, demobilization of all of the violent militias, including Hamas, and there are several others as well, which have backers throughout the Middle East. So the first thing is that it would be possible for the U.S. to find a unanimity other than Israel in the rest of the United Nations member states. It would be possible to find a full agreement on this with the Arab and Islamic leaders. And this is not a hunch on my part. One needs merely to look at the statement that the Arab and Islamic leaders made from their emergency meeting in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a couple of days ago. They didn't call for the destruction of Israel. They didn't wail about the evils. They said this needs a political solution now to save the lives of the people of Palestine, but also for the security of Israel. In other words, for everybody's security, this war needs to stop immediately, and we need a two-state solution. And in that statement by the Arab and Islamic leaders, they pointed out a document which is absolutely important and fascinating for people to refresh their memories or to learn about for the first time if they don't know about it. And that is the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, also spearheaded by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And what in 2002 the Arab leaders said is, we will normalize relations with Israel. We will have diplomatic relations. We will end the state of war with the achievement of a state of Palestine in a two-state solution. We will help to guarantee the security of Israel. One of the great lies of our time is there's no one to talk to. That's what Netanyahu and his cronies say. The ones to talk to are Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and indeed, by the way, Iran as well, which is actively engaged in constructive diplomacy that we have blown off repeatedly, including the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which was the deal in 2015 with Iran to end sanctions as part of the disbandment by Iran of any nuclear program. And then Trump walked away from that, and Biden never walked back to it. All of this is to say there's plenty of grounds for constructive diplomacy right now for Israel's security. So why doesn't it happen? Because the Netanyahu government doesn't want it to happen. Because that constructive security is constructive towards a Palestinian state.
But what about the Biden government? Like, I don't see any signs that the Biden administration is using its massive leverage over Israel as the primary sponsor of Tel Aviv. Why isn't it? Why isn't it?
You know, we can't know for sure, but I would say my best guess is that senior politicians of Biden's generation, okay, this is the septuagenarian and octogenarian generation, are trained by instinct. Never show a glimmer of space between yourself and Israel because you will feel a backlash. And I think that it is just political instinct. You know, that's basically what Biden rides on these days anyway, is whatever instinctual motives or urges come to him. But I think it's basically that they believe don't show any space with Israel. That's the prudent measure for an American politician. by the way, it's completely wrong. It's so out of date. But we're seeing that sense of being out of date everywhere. We're seeing it on the campuses as well, where the older generation is pro-Israel and can't understand anything but complete pro-Israel sentiment. And the students are saying, but we're watching this mass slaughter taking place in Gaza. This is not right. And so there's a generational divide on the campuses. There's a generational divide in the broader population. There's a generational divide among the voters. But my guess is that this is instinct and out of date. Spin doctors in the White House telling Biden, you've got to do it this way. And this is not a strong president, and it's an extraordinarily weak foreign policy team. They've gotten everything wrong. Remember, it's Jake Sullivan who said 2 weeks before October 7 that the Middle East is the quietest that it's been in 20 years. And actually, in that article in Foreign Affairs, specifically said that the tensions in Gaza have been wound down. So this is a group that's out of touch, not competent, and I think just relying on what were the instincts of American politicians for decades, which is back Israel to the hilt no matter what. But now it is literally isolated the United States, so it's 191 against 2, and it's not in America's interest. But by the way, I think people listening should understand this is not in Israel's interest. I'm not saying a word against Israel's interest. Israel is being damaged so severely by this miserable person, Netanyahu, who should be in prison, by the way, because he's also corrupt on top of being miserable in so many other ways. But Israel is being incredibly endangered by the wrong-headed approach that Israel's taking.
Yeah, we're about to talk to Michael Tracy, who's spent the last several weeks traveling throughout Israel, and there's a lot of critics of Netanyahu, and there's a lot of critics of the Israeli war effort, even more so, I think, in Israel than people, at least in the elite classes of the United States, feel comfortable expressing. I want to ask you about Ukraine, but before I do, you mentioned college campuses. There has been a huge amount of focus over the last several years by the American pundit class, political class, on college campuses. I think a lot of people couldn't figure out why. I think you put your finger on one of the reasons, which is that there are some doctrines developing there that the American elite on a bipartisan level have never accepted and fear and dislike, one of which is this questioning of why we're so blindly supportive of Israel. And there's been this massive focus on college students since the outbreak of this war, trying to have billionaires compile a list of students who should be put on no hire blacklists because they signed petitions that were insufficiently supportive of Israel or overly critical of Israel. We've had efforts to pressure faculty to stop allowing pro-Palestinian protests from mega donors who are telling these schools we're going to withhold funding in the event that you don't change your policy or that you don't institutionally defend Israel. One of the centerpieces of that controversy is Harvard. I just had Professor Walt on my show, Stephen Walt, who talked about the situation at Harvard. But the other institution that often gets focused on with this issue is Columbia, which is where you're at. Talk to me a little bit about the concerns you have about the climates being the focus on American academic campuses, on the potential chilling effect. We interviewed some Harvard students who were put on those no-hire lists for having signed this statement. They're having trucks riding around the Harvard campus with their face on it, a megaphone blaring that they hate Jews and are anti-Semitic. Imagine the kind of harassment that brings. What has been your sense of what's happening on the Columbia campus?
Look, I think there's one thing that universities should be doing right now, and that is having discussions, sessions, lectures, teach-ins about history, about this conflict, about what is really happening, not only the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I would say Ukraine as well. The students are absolutely unnerved and upset by a world of war. And one of the responsibilities of the university is to discuss these issues, not to clamp down, for God's sake, not to say this is impermissible, but actually to teach, to learn, to discuss, to analyze together. There's not enough of that going on by a long shot. And this is quite disturbing, because the universities should be thinking institutions. They are institutions of diverse views. They should be places of vigorous, open debate, but especially honest and open inquiry. Columbia has the greatest historian of modern Palestine, Rashid Khalidi. He's brilliant. His books are magnificent books about the history and the plight of Palestine during the last century. Students need to read those, to understand, to listen to Professor Khalidi and others, to have an open discussion of all of this. Instead, of course, we've had not that kind of educational experience. We've had confrontation, donors yelling, threatening to withhold their funds if you don't crack down on this and that, the doxing. It's horrible. I mean, this is so bad for American society to have that approach, rather than saying, my God, this is very serious. Let's understand this. And of course, we're not really in an understanding mood on so many things in this country. When we talked about Ukraine, there was a lot to understand. That was one of the things I've seen close up for 30 years, because I was involved as an advisor to Gorbachev, to Yeltsin, to Kuchma in Ukraine more than 30 years ago. And I wanted people to understand the background. What's the history? Read about this, understand it, debate it. But of course, everything got nailed down. If you say one word that isn't completely in line with beating Russia, you're a Putin lover. Everything was to shut down debate and understanding, rather than to discuss, understand, and analyze. And we're not serving our national interest, our social interest, our university's interest or capacity if we approach it that way. So it's not good.
Absolutely. So let me ask you, just my final question about Ukraine. Those of us who are Kremlin agents, who are official Russian apologists on various lists and stuff.
There we go.
Yeah, we're having a little confederation of Putin apologists on the show. We have another one coming up. Got put there because for months we were saying, look, it seems like the U.S. fueling of this war is actually making things a lot worse, that it doesn't seem like Ukraine will be able to win. Russia is a much larger country. The front line hasn't moved in a year. There have been tens of thousands of young Ukrainian conscripts and Russian soldiers as well who are losing their lives over the kind of inch-by-inch trench warfare that came to dominate World War I. And at the end of the day, there's no way Ukraine can expel Russia from that territory for all sorts of reasons. This should have been handled at the diplomatic table way early on. The Americans obviously didn't want that. And now here we are 18 months later with a new war, having spent over $100 billion. I think even Washington and intelligence agencies throughout the West that were so gung-ho about Ukrainian victory are now finally coming to face the music that the Russians and that the Ukrainians are going to have to sit down. And part of that negotiation, whether you hate it or not, is going to be a ceding of some portion of Ukrainian territory to the Russians beyond the Crimean Peninsula that they already had control of since 2014. Looking back now on everything that has happened and where we are, what do you make of the last year of enormous amounts of loss of life and just the burning of huge amounts of resources on a war that really hasn't moved in over a year?
Well, I think, of course, this is another massive, massive U.S. foreign policy disaster. Right at the beginning, I wrote a piece called the latest neocon debacle, because the way that this is played out was completely foreseeable from the start. that this was going to go very badly.
And not just foreseeable, but predicted by people like you and Professor Mearsheimer and plenty of people who came through my program predicting with their foreign policy expertise that exactly what has happened would happen.
Yeah, I would say this one was not very hard to see. Like you said, how could you beat Russia? It was pretty obvious. And, you know, these people just are not very clever. Biden, Newland, Sullivan, Blinken, they've been at this back since 2014. This whole debacle goes back at least to 2008. So we're in the 15th year of this debacle. Arguably, it goes back 30 years. But let's just stay at 2008 for one moment. You know, the point is the U.S. has played a losing hand badly for 15 straight years. And this is really important to understand if one wants to learn a little bit about geopolitical poker, which is we keep raising the stakes on a losing hand because Russia wasn't demanding Ukrainian territory in 2007 and 2008. It was demanding one thing: don't move NATO in. That's all. Perfectly sensible. Our top diplomats like Bill Burns, who was ambassador to Russia, said as much then, wrote the famous "Niet means Niet" memo that was known to the public through WikiLeaks so that we really knew what they were saying. But nobody heeded that, of course, in the political class. Then came Newland as the point person for the U.S. In conspiring in the overthrow of the Yanukovych presidency in Ukraine in February 2014. And his offense was he wanted neutrality. That's all. Russia wasn't demanding territory under Yanukovych. All they wanted, and they got, was a long-term lease of the Sevastopol naval base, the Russian naval base since 1783. They got a lease till 2042. But for the United States, this was not good enough. We needed NATO there. So Newland helped and friends, and I know a lot of what happened behind the scenes, helped to take out Yanukovych. And then Putin grabbed Crimea. Referendum, took Crimea, but still was not demanding anything more than that, not demanding territory. All that Russia was demanding was don't shell the ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, give a measure of autonomy. And that got negotiated in the so-called Minsk I and then Minsk II agreements. The Minsk II agreement was adopted 15-0 in the Security Council. Russia wasn't saying, we want to own eastern Donbass. Russia was saying, enforce an agreement that unanimously was adopted by the UN Security Council. Well, that wasn't good enough for the United States. The U.S. told Ukraine, don't worry about it. You don't have to implement that. We know that. We know that in some detail. So up until December 2021, Russia was not demanding more territory. But in December 17th, 2021, President Putin put on the table the draft U.S.-Russia security arrangements based on two things. One, no NATO enlargement, and second, a negotiation over the placement of U.S. missile systems, especially Aegis missile systems, in Eastern Europe, which Russia regarded understandably as a threat to Russia. The United States gave its formal reply in January 2022. We don't have to discuss any of that with you. That was the reply. We don't have to discuss NATO with you. It's none of your business. So even then, till that moment, Russia wasn't demanding any territory. Then came the special military operation. The Russian Duma recognized the independence of Lugansk and Donetsk, didn't annex them, recognized the independence because we had lost the chance of just implementing the Minsk agreements. And then within 3 days of the start of the special military operation, Zelensky said, no, maybe we should negotiate, maybe neutrality. And in March of 2022, Russia and Ukraine negotiated an agreement based around Ukrainian neutrality. So here comes the U.S. with its lousy hand, upping the ante again by running over to Kiev and telling them, no, you're not going to negotiate that. We're not going to give you any protection on that. So we blew it again. Then over the summer, Russia mobilizes. In the fall, it annexes the 4 oblasts, not only Lugansk and Donetsk, but Zaporizhia and the Kherson district, getting worse and worse for the United States. And then we tell them, don't worry, we've got your back. You just launch a major counteroffensive. Now, anyone watching at the time knew there was nothing there militarily. But there's our generals strutting out, oh, we're so optimistic, said General Petraeus and others. What was clearly an impossibility. It seems nobody knows for sure in this delusional approach of the government that maybe they thought this coup by Prigozhin was the secret weapon. Who knows? But anyway, this was a complete debacle, of course. Ukraine lost tens of thousands of people in a very short period of time. It lost, again, the armies that had been built up, the military hardware, the tanks, all the artillery systems and so forth. And here we are. They've raised the stakes for 15 years on a losing hand, and they can't get it. And this is our team. They failed. Biden, okay. We need a new foreign policy team, and we need a new foreign policy approach, and we need to negotiate before Ukraine is completely destroyed.
No, it's absolutely right. And remember, Odessa was a Greek city to a very large extent. And the trading was, Greek traders, of course, Armenian traders, Jewish traders. These networks of trade were extensive. And you're absolutely correct that everybody knows each other extremely well. The Turks and the Greeks, of course, they know each other. Everybody knows each other. And I was actually just had the pleasure of having a long discussion with the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, which goes back to, I don't remember whether it's the 1st century AD or the 2nd century AD. He's a Christian patriarch in Damascus, in an Aramaic-speaking community, for heaven's sake. This is 2,000 years. And, of course, we were discussing exactly this wonderful mix of local cultures in Syria. And Barack Obama sends in the CIA in 2012 to overthrow Assad, lights the match, blows up the place, not knowing anything about Syria, about its history, about its culture, about its diversity, just lighting the match. And so I think it's a fascinating thing, and it's really worth contemplating. I can think of let's consider 3 great empires of this region. First, the Persian Empire, going back the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great, who, by the way, saved the Jewish people. He allowed the exiles from Babylonia to return to Jerusalem. And the idea that Iran and and Israel are natural enemies is fatuous, given that the actual history of the two goes back to the 6th century BC, close relations. But what I was going to say about the Persians, they were very clever. They allowed local rule, local religions, and huge diversity. And so actually the Jewish Second Temple period in
in today's Israel, but back in the 4th and 3rd century, was under the suzerainty of Persia, because it was a very tolerant system. Then came Alexander the Great's conquests between 331 and 323 BC. And of course, he reached India, created the Hellenistic empires. But his genius, even as this kid, although he had the greatest teacher in history, in my view, Aristotle, but Alexander knew, take local traditions, don't try to impose things, let things be. And so the Hellenistic kingdoms, of course, brought wonderful Greek culture, Greek language, Greek knowledge, Greek wisdom, but also with a lot of local tolerance and incredible diversity. And the Ottomans, I don't know, as a Greek, you may have a bit more jaundiced view of the Ottomans than I do. I rather like the Ottomans in a lot of ways, but they had, of course, multiple minority communities who lived peacefully. That is why His All Holiness, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, lives in Istanbul, Constantinople, and keeps his throne as the Patriarch of Greek Orthodoxy, or the All Ecumenical Patriarch, I should say, because the Ottomans kept all sorts of communities within the Ottoman Empire. And you can see these minority communities till today, local religion, local language, local cultures. It's quite wonderful. And that, I would say, is your point, that lots of wars, but actually the fact that the diversity has remained for 2 millennia plus means that this wasn't mass extinctions, genocides, attempts to impose one faith or one religion. And the Jewish community in today's modern Iran was not forced out by the Iranians. It was pulled out by the Zionist movement of Israel, which tried to bring everyone to Israel and depleted all of these ancient, long-standing, traditional Jewish communities. And I find that very, very sad, actually, because that diversity is an incredible cultural strength, but also an economic strength because of the trading systems.
And that brings me to the point about Israel, because, of course, Israel can become a part of this system. As I said, a system where everybody learns to live with everybody else. Tensions exist. And, of course, the point is that in the modern world, the kind of tensions that used to exist in the Middle East, the wars, which are usually wars between local dynasties, they're not exactly the same as European wars, if you know your medieval history of this part of the world well. That period of war, anyway, is obsolete, but the trade is not. And I myself, and I was very, very impressed by that meeting in Riyadh. Actually,
I was too.
I mean, everybody came together. Erdogan was there, Assad was there, the Saudis were there, everybody was there, and they were all talking. The Iranians were there, and they were all talking together, and they were all talking together as a region, as a place where, and they were coming up with sophisticated political points. And I have to say, I felt that this does provide a real opening and a future, both for a political settlement of this crisis, which in my opinion is the ultimate crisis behind all the others in the Middle East, and also for the potential economic and social development of this region. If they can all come together and work together, and almost just about there doing it, then all of these synergies that do exist in the Middle East can finally start coming together, and then we could start to think of the Middle East in a completely different way.
It is absolutely the case. And the utter tragedy of what's happening right now, beyond the human disaster that Israel is causing, is that there is a clear path to peace. No question about it. The Israeli line, which I've heard for more than 50 years, there's no one to talk to on the other side, is such BS. There's no other way to put it, because the other side keeps saying, we want peace, we want normal relations, but you have to respect the fact that there are the Palestinian people who have political rights that need to be observed. It's really as simple as that. And when you look at this, and it is the terrible frustration. What's stopping that in Israel? What's stopping that is two different groups. One that happens to be in power right now, but there really is a group of zealots who believe, as a matter of theology, that all the land is promised to the Jews, and it's in the book of Joshua, and this is ours, no matter who happens to be there. And, you know, it's a completely unacceptable view, an extraordinarily dangerous one. It is not the majority view in Israel, but it is a powerful view. And the way Israeli politics works, which is to give added weight to small groups that tip the balance to majorities in multi-party coalitions, they have a loud voice. And some of these people, like Smotrich in the cabinet, who's the finance minister, are vulgar and destroying Israel because of their, a kind of genocidal intent, actually. So that's one group. The other group says, no, for security, we dare not risk making peace. And the stupid thing that they did, of course, but it was very premeditated, and it played games with the first group and won their support politically, was the settlements process after the 1967 war, when the secularists said, you know, we don't trust Palestinians to have a state, so we're going to put Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory. And this was, to the famous expression back in 1970, was to put facts on the ground. And now there are more than 400,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and there are another 200 to 250,000 in East Jerusalem. And it's facts that have made peace so much harder to achieve. But the main point, from my point of view, is these settlements are illegal. They have been declared illegal repeatedly by the Security Council. And so I want the Security Council to vote a two-state solution along the 4th of June, 1967 borders, like it is declared for more than 50 years, and get on with peace. And Israel would find that it has plenty of neighbors to do business with, to have peaceful relations with, to have tourism with, and every other thing. But they need to stop the zealots who don't see this way, and they need to have some self-understanding that the other side has been talking about peace for decades. Israelis haven't wanted to hear it. And the United States has basically, unconditionally backed Israel until today. Let's be clear, whatever Blinken and others are saying about protecting civilians is a total sham, because it's American bombs dropping on Gaza every day right now. So this is not Americans protecting anything. They know perfectly well what they're doing. And that brings us back to the U.S. side and also to Britain and the European imperial side, there is something about the evangelical religious view that has said we can control these things. And it's a little less tolerant. The fundamentalist evangelical Christian view in the United States, which is probably the most pro-Zionist part of American politics, okay, at least alongside the Jewish community. But that view is, again, a kind of God-given, we have the right to rule view. And that is not what peaceful coexistence is about. Peaceful coexistence is about mutual respect, not the belief that one is the chosen one to rule in a particular place or to rule every place.
I wanted to shift a bit out of the Middle East. It's okay, but still it's an economic question, I guess, because a big thing happening now this week, of course, was the Chinese meeting with the EU. I think this was the first time they really met since the pandemic, and it kind of had the same issues where we. Because you spoke previously about the mindset in the United States, but it's a similar challenge now in Europe, I feel, because globalization is turning out very differently than many of the EU leaders suggested. It was supposed to be one which was Western-centric. And of course, now the key challenge or concern, I guess, from Brussels would be that the Europeans are becoming very dependent on China, but China not so much dependent on Europe. So this asymmetry is something that's spooking, I think, the Europeans. So the key language you now hear from the EU would be de-risking, decoupling. But again, this is a dilemma for the Europeans, because if the Europeans would sever themselves from China, sever themselves from Chinese technologies and resources, like they cut themselves off Russian resources, it would make the European less economic, competitive, less prosperous, and also their dependence then would increase on the United States, which would effectively make them more politically obedient. So this is not a good option. But on the other side, if they accept more economic connectivity with China, the concern is that the dependence would grow. So they have been looking for ways out. Well, one of them would be, hey, how about we put some sanctions on China where it fits us? But then, of course, the Europeans are very, very offended when the Chinese retaliate, because this is supposed to be a one-way tool. So, they try to frame it in human rights, because this is a good way of legitimizing one-sided sanctions. But again, the Chinese doesn't appear to want to have anything to do with it. The Europeans, for example, cite the treatment of Uyghurs, but at the same time, von der Leyen doesn't want to even call for ceasefire when the Israelis are, carpet bombing Gaza. So this doesn't really work. They're also trying to blame China for supporting Russia, even though, of course, the Europeans had a lot to do with provoking this war, and now also sending all these weapons. So China pretty much took the same position as the majority of the world population, which was, not supporting Russia's invasion, but also not supporting NATO's proxy war. Anyways, my point is, or questions, I guess, would be, how do you see this? How would Europe overcome this dilemma of, not wanting to become too dependent on China? Because, for example, to look at the electric car market, that the Europeans simply can't compete with the Chinese. If the Chinese cars are coming here, electric cars especially, then there's no room for the European market, because on a high quality, low cost Chinese cars versus the lower quality, higher priced European ones, the Europe would deindustrialize simply because Europe's no longer competitive. But again, going against the Chinese is also not a great solution. So, what would your advice be to the Europeans? Ideally, that would have become before this meeting.
Yeah, first, I don't think Europe or the United States can ever again talk about human rights the way they do. This claim Xinjiang is a genocide, which was absurd, completely fatuous to begin with, just a debating point or talking point. And then when a real genocide's taking place, they don't do anything. It's right before our eyes. Mass slaughter, mass killings, mass ethnic cleansing, and they suck their thumbs. They don't do anything. So all of these arguments that have been used are phony geopolitical narrative arguments. They're games. They're not real. And some people may think they're making real arguments, but they should understand that the governments are making phony arguments. And I took this on with the US State Department when it talked about a genocide in Xinjiang without providing even one paragraph of backup, by the way. It's just games. So they should attend to the genocide that they're a party to, which is the one taking place in Gaza right now, and get this war stopped immediately. Now, when it comes to China, basically what's happening is that van der Leyen is just following U.S. instructions. I don't even think that this is a European view. This is the American view, falling behind your leader. And I blame Europe for constantly falling in behind the United States, because it's falling further and further behind by doing so. It's just absolute. Look at the trap that the U.S. got Europe into vis-a-vis Ukraine. Complete trap. Of course, the Europeans are not completely innocent of this. They watched the overthrow of Yanukovych. They went along with it. Why doesn't and the European leaders privately said things to me. Oh, yes, you're right, it's NATO. And then they say the opposite the next day. So I've heard the hypocrisy directly to me. I mean, to me, they tell me one thing, they say something publicly the next day. They're just following the U.S. Look, one day the United States decided Huawei is an enemy. Now, why? To my mind, because if it's a U.S. system, they can spy on me. But if it's a Chinese system, they can't spy on me so easily. So I trust Huawei equipment for my privacy more than I trust American equipment for sure, because I know what Ed Snowden explained to me, by the way, in a 8-hour face-to-face discussion once about what my own government's doing to me. So, but as soon as the U.S. said it, oh, the Europeans have to cut out Huawei everywhere. You know, they just follow the U.S. lead. And van der Leyen's not the most clever person I've ever seen. It's not like there really are some original ideas there. And European foreign policy is shambolic right now. And Germany, sad to say, has really nobody has done more damage in peacetime to the German economy than the Greens, and Scholz letting them do it. And this is all very sad. So my advice to the Europeans, trade with China. Keep good relations with China. Improve your vehicles, of course. Don't be late. But Europe's pretty clever. The Europeans like a good quality of life, and they have it. Europe has the highest quality of life on the planet. The shortest working hours, the highest living standards, the longest vacation time, the longest life expectancy. The Chinese work a lot longer hours, a lot harder, and so on. That's part of the trade-off. But I think Europe gets its high living standards by being clever, well-educated, technologically sophisticated, and yes, Europe should have a more strategic view. It fell behind, look, Europe makes the leading advanced chips in the world, but it's all under US control. Why doesn't Europe have its own control over ASML chip making capacity? No, the US dictates everything. This is Europe's mistake right now. Europe's interest is not US hegemony. Europe's interest is a peaceful, sustainable world and meeting China literally halfway on the Eurasian continent. If Europe had a good investment program, it would be investing fast rail out to somewhere in central Russia or out to Samarkand, and China would be investing in fast rail westward, and we would meet in the middle and celebrate the 21st century Silk Road, which after all is the whole idea of, and that would bring prosperity to everybody. China is not going to invade Europe. China is not a threat to Europe, period.
I completely agree. I mean, the idea that trade is a geopolitical threat, because that's what it amounts to, that trading with China is somehow conjuring up some kind of geopolitical threat. The trading with Russia was a geopolitical threat. It is so completely misconceived. It is so profoundly wrong. And you could see that what's happening is that some people, it just go back to what you were saying about the dollar at the start of the program. Some people want to use these trade instruments as geopolitical instruments themselves.
By the way, this is exactly Jake Sullivan's sophomoric idea. And it's sophomoric in the sense that you would expect to read it in a sophomore essay, but they're actually putting it into policy in the US that we need to weaponize trade. We need to weaponize the dollar. He wrote about this in the campaign in 2020. I thought it was a lousy article. I couldn't imagine it would become actual American policy. But the thing that I could never imagine is that the Europeans would stop thinking like they have and just follow along with the US. And this is really the big mistake.
Yeah. Professor Sachs, we've had you for, it's been an absolutely phenomenal program. We've talked about China and the Middle East and Europe. But I think because we've pivoted back to Eurasia, perhaps I'm going to suggest that we finish. Perhaps, Glenn, you've got something to say about Eurasia, because this is something that you've been studying and following very closely. You just met Professor Sachs talked about the Chinese and the Europeans building their railway lines and meeting. Well, why could we not do that? Isn't that exactly what was offered? And wouldn't it have been a great thing if it had happened? And wasn't that what Putin was advising and saying we should do? And isn't that essentially what Xi Jinping is telling us the Europeans to do? So over to you, Glenn.
No, I don't really have any much more to add, but I was thinking the same, that it seems a lot of our policies in this greater Eurasian space from the Atlantic to the Pacific is very contradictory, because we're always very worried that China's going to be this central power which everyone will be dependent on, but at the same time, we're sanctioning the Russians, so the Russians become more reliant on China. We're going after the Iranians, so the Iranians are going more to China. So it seems like the solution are concerned that the world, all roads will go to China, could be solved by ending a lot of this sanctions war, because in this way, the Iranians have the same interest. They want to diversify their economic connectivity. They don't want to put all their eggs in one basket where they could be taken advantage of. They want to, connect with Europe. They want to connect with Russia. They want to connect with China. And this is, I think, a lot of what you see across this Eurasian space. It's about decentralizing and diversifying to prevent everything from being decided from one center, which allows it to be used as a political weapon, which allows economic connectivity, which should be a source of peace, to again become a economic weapon. So I think,
and maybe we could end with one more terrible example of this that shows all that's wrong and all that could be right, and that is Italy just renounced participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is quite fascinating, because Italy, back in 2019, knew that trade with China is a good thing for Italy, because the Chinese love Italian brands, and the Italians have stylish brands, and the Chinese love it. And it brings a lot of income, a lot of wealth to Italy. And so Italy signed up, as it should, to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, just a couple of months ago, Prime Minister Meloni was called to Washington and was told by Biden, you've got to get out of this. And dutifully, Italy has told the Chinese, we are leaving the Belt and Road Initiative, and then we still want trade with China. We don't want to be misunderstood and so forth. But they left. Why did they leave? Not because even intrinsic fear of China, not because it was hurting the Italian economy, not because Italy lacked things to sell to China. No, they left for one simple reason. The United States told them to do so.
UN is now reporting that more than 570,000 people in Gaza are now starving due to fallout from the war. We've seen tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, the large number of them civilians, people that are very supportive of the Israeli handling of this. They'll say that's terrible, it's tragic, but the tragedy is all born because of the actions of Hamas. They're responsible for these people starving and for all the civilian casualties. I know you've been quite critical of Israel's handling of this war since October 7th. Once October 7th occurred, and once we saw these Hamas terrorists kill all these Israelis, including Israeli civilians, capture others and kidnap them, what should the response from Israel have been? What would have been the proper way, in your view, to handle it after October 7th?
The Arab states immediately met. In fact, there was an Arab Islamic summit in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, where all the neighboring states and Iran, by the way, together said, we will secure Israel and Palestine and work to make sure that there is safety and peace. But there has to be a follow-up to 56 years of a promise of a Palestinian state. This is a position I completely subscribe to. You can't look at this as starting in October 7 because on October 6, Gaza was at a boil. And years leading up to October 7, all independent observers knew that the situation was explosive. The United States, again, was faking it. In fact, faking it or so incompetent, and it's hard to tell the difference sometimes. But Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, actually said 2 weeks before October 7 that the Middle East is quieter than it has been in 20 years, and the crisis in Gaza is basically resolved. Now, such absurdity shows either a detachment from reality or an inability to look at basic facts or an unwillingness to look at basic facts. The point I'm making is that, like all conflicts, this has a political root. The political root is that Israel and Palestine need both to have security and to live side by side. That was the judgment of the international community in the immediate aftermath of the 1967 war in Resolution 242 of the UN Security Council. It was followed after 1973 by UN Security Council Resolution 338, and since then by dozens of Security Council and General Assembly resolutions saying the two nations need to live side by side in peace on the 1967 borders. And since 2002, the Arab League, that is the countries in the Arab region, have said very explicitly that they want peace and normalization with Israel based on the international law, based on two states. Now, the Israelis have rejected that. Netanyahu, who has been in power basically since 2009 with the short breaks, is dead set against it. And this is not a surmise. That's the party platform of Likud. And the platform of not only Netanyahu, but even more extreme positions of the rest of his cabinet is that there should be one country, Greater Israel, extending from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. And for a number of the members of the cabinet, that's because, in their view, God gave them the land in the book of Joshua, in the Bible, and that's just the way it's going to be. Now, we will never have peace on that basis. And the finance minister Smotrich, who calls himself a fascist, by the way, it's not putting words in his mouth. He jokes about it. Smotrich, the interior minister Ben-Gvir, the defense minister Gallant, the prime minister Netanyahu are dead set against any politics. So they say the only thing we can do is destroy Hamas, which basically is tantamount to mass ethnic cleansing, and according to some legal specialists, such as the Center for Constitutional Rights here in New York, tantamount to genocide, both intent and action. The United States is every day providing the bombs for this. 20,000 people minimum have been killed, because that's the body count, not all the people under the rubble. 70% of those killed are women and children. It's a massacre. It is an outright, out-and-out massacre. It is massive war crimes, and it's all done to avoid any negotiation and any talk of politics. It's done in the name of so-called Greater Israel. And that is an ideology. That is a religious view for these religious nationalists, which is a category of Judaism in Israel, of extreme right-wing nationalists. It's not a category of the religion per se, but of a group that happens to have a lot of the cabinet in the current government. So the fact of the matter is, we are abetting a view that is absolutely a literal dead end and a metaphorical dead end to any kind of peace other than slaughter. The United States knows it. American politicians are trained never to say anything bad about Israel. What Israel's doing is massive war crimes. It is despicable, and it's in the vision of something that is impossible in terms of any kind of peace in that region. It's deadly. It's against international law. The Americans know it. And, of course, Biden is just really a pathetic, I mean, he's pathetic, actually, and he's pathetically weak president, and his team is pathetically weak. They don't know what to do, except they keep giving the bombs every day. That's it.
I'll end with this, sir. A lot of people that are supportive of Israel, they also view Israel very much as the good guys in all of these conflicts, the victim based on what happened on October 7th. And when they wage war, people tell the story of Israel waging war very ethically, not only providing warnings, not only leafleting, not only using dummy bombs, but actually when they need to do something like invade or take over a hospital, they'll bring incubators for the people in that hospital, which is something that the defenders of Israel will point out is not something that's typically done by hostile armies. Two-part question, and I realize we're way long, so I'll make this my final question here. One, what is Israel doing that's exactly a war crime, and what is the fallacy in the notion that Israel is waging an ethical war? And then lastly, if you could tie this into that answer, is Israel safer today than they were on October 6th?
Yeah, and you know, I'd like to say, just if people don't know me and they may think I'm an Israel hater or something, I've been going to Israel for more than 50 years. I have family in Israel. I am not an Israel hater. I am so sad and upset by this. I can't even tell you. This is a tragedy, and it is a self-destruction of Israel. This is not bringing any security at all to Israel. This is absolutely threatening Israel fundamentally, because the entire world is standing against Israel, because Israel is slaughtering innocent people every day. And the only backer that Israel has is the United States. And in the United States, much of the public is aghast at what we're doing, as I am, absolutely aghast. And young people are completely shocked by this. So Israel is losing even its last defender because it's doing the undefensible. It is just killing people in extraordinary numbers, innocent people. Let me say, without getting into all of the specifics, in my opinion, Israel's doing nothing to protect civilians. It is using dumb bombs. It is deliberately blowing up apartment buildings. It is blowing up hospitals. It is blowing up schools. It has weaponized food, and there are hundreds of thousands of people that are profoundly hungry, and I don't know if starving is right, but that's a term that is being used by UN officials right now. I do not accept that Israel's taking any precautions. Israel is using mass force to ethnically cleanse this region. That was their plan. The plan was, we're going to scare everybody so that they flee to the south and force Egypt to accept these people. That is the plan. And the plan didn't work because Egypt said no. And the United States buckled on it also, because the United States didn't want to be so visibly a party to ethnic cleansing. But I haven't heard one credible military expert from outside Israel, and I don't find the IDF spokespeople credible at all, but any independent outside expert say anything other than what Israel is doing is destroying a civilian population. And it's before our eyes. Even American officials like Lloyd Austin mumble this. Of course, this is the terrible fact of American politics. There's no truth in anything our government officials say about anything anymore. They just don't even have the idea of telling the truth as a basic standard of daily life. So it's not specific to this. They lie about every single thing that is in front of them, because everything is spin now.